Frame rate, input latency, refresh rate, it can get very confusing for some. So I'm going to dive into it in some detail and also use my input latency test to see just what all these things actually mean and whether or not it makes a difference in gameplay over and above the visual improvement from that faster frame rate. I've covered this before with my input latency on Rise of the Tomb Raider, but yet again we've seen another performance patch of a big title just in time for the DLC release on Dark Souls 3. This time it gets a full-on pro patch. Now I'm not suspecting this is anything more than simply using the additional resource available for the pro. What I simply mean is the additional resource available from the CPU and GPU upclock and bandwidth is being used here rather than rewriting code to make better use of the GCN architecture available in this particular machine. Think of it very similar to what you would get from the boost mode title if it ran an unlocked frame rate. In fact, I'll cover that a little later in the video. So this title was always 30 FPS on both consoles, the Xbox One and the PS4, but now they've chosen to unlock that frame rate. There is no option to cap it back to 30 till once you download the latest 1.11 patch. You now are stuck with this unlocked version. Now the game suffered from the infamous frame pacing that From Software seems to have. This is exactly the same engine that fueled Blood-Borne, bar some nips and tucks. This also means that it presents exactly the same issues we saw on the PS4 release there on both the Xbox One and the PS4 with its cap to 30 FPS. That's right, the infamous frame pacing does return and is ever persistent across the title. This means you get frames skipping from 16, 33 and 49.9 milliseconds, making input latency and refresh rate feel unresponsive and uneven, and this gives that judder as if the game is slowing down, but really it's not. It tends to hold a flat 30 FPS across every second most of the time, and this also points to the fact that just looking at frame rates at that level is not really the most important thing, and it's why I cover frame times, because they are very important indeed. Average frame rate is also not as important, even though it does give you a statistic of just how well a title runs, but there's other things that you can look at that I've covered many times before on previous videos and my website articles. And these are things like the most persistent frame time or percentile graph, and also the lowest frame time and the highest frame time, which gives you an idea of the kind of variation you're getting throughout play. And even if you're not into these kind of things, you can certainly feel it and see it, even if you're not consciously aware of what's going on. Now, the boost mode for Blood-Borne was very minimal. It basically smoothed out some of the frame pacing issues, but not all of them, so it didn't fix the issue, it just kind of reduced the issue. But here with Dark Souls 3, the fact that they've taken the lock off the frame rate, then you now have a ceiling going all the way up to 60 FPS, although it very rarely hits that point, but it can hit that point, which is the most important part of an unlocked frame rate. So you now see a far more consistent, smoother and faster response and refresh rate over the standard PS4 version. It no longer hits the ceiling of 30 FPS, which is a half rate interval of most people's TV screens. Imagine that a screen refreshes at 60 frames per second, 60 Hz. That means for every second you get 60 new pictures on screen. That will always happen, but some games like Blood-Borne, like Dark Souls 3, like Uncharted, like Gears of War 4 in the single player, they all cap their frame rate at half that interval, which means every 2 images you get 1 new frame from the console, and in a 60 FPS you get twice that amount, so you get a new image for every time the screen will update, and this obviously is twice as fast, therefore it feels twice as smooth. But this doesn't ultimately translate to always having half the input latency, and that means when you press the button and the action on screen is performed, so when you press shoot and it shoots, or when you press roll and it rolls. So looking at the title of Dark Souls 3 here, by potentially doubling the frame rate, we should also see double the input latency, correct? Well, no, because there's a lot more things that come into a game's rendering, input latency loops and game loops than just frame rate alone. The refresh rate and the rendering rate is only part of the conversation. This title hasn't had core changes to the game code, and that includes the input polling loop. So this means that you now get to see a frame or your action quicker than you did before at its highest point. So between the two versions we can see a comparison. Now here on screen you can see a visual comparison between the old version on the base PS4 and the new version on the Pro, with it boosted up to 60 FPS. And you can see the average comes in around 50, later on it drops down to around 48, and that really is not ideal for a 60 FPS title, but it's certainly much better than what we're presented with on the 30 title here on the PS4. But this is far from the most pertinent or important. What is the frame time difference between the two. On the base PS4 we see 157 50 millisecond spikes. Now we see absolutely zero of those in these like-for-like tests on screen on the Pro mode with it boosted to 60. And this is an improvement that you can see and feel as you play the title. Far more important than just the frame rate alone is the consistency of those frames. You are no longer spiking between 30 milliseconds, which you did before, which is the basic standard refresh rate of a 30Hz game. You're now only spiking between 16 milliseconds, which is 100% improvement to the frame time in this video and why it feels smoother to play. And is obviously the best way to play it on consoles now. The PC version is still the way to go. If you've got a good enough PC, you can play it at 60 FPS. That is how it should be. But between the two, anyone playing the 30Hz version and this version will instantly see, feel and appreciate the benefit it brings. This is a welcome boost and much better than the inconsistent 30Hz version. I will always play this version over and above the old version now. There's no way I'd go back, and I think you'd really be struggling to pick anyone that would also choose the same. And it also begs the question, would Blood-Borne benefit? Well, of course I think it would. The chances of them doing it though are very slim. That title is pretty much dead now. There's probably more likely to be a sequel than we are to see this kind of boost on that version. So do all games benefit then from this? Because this title clearly benefits from an unlocked frame rate. Well, no. Final Fantasy 15 was recently patched and offered in a 60Hz or more likely an unlocked frame rate, but that doesn't achieve anywhere near the level of consistency this does. And the main reason why that is because it still hits the peaks of 50 millisecond gaps, and therefore it can drop below 30Hz. And this is the most important thing. It's not the fact that the game spikes from 30 to 60. Any game that has a variable frame rate is going to do that due to the refresh rate of the screen, unless of course you have VSync off and then the game will be allowed to tear. But in Final Fantasy 15, we're seeing a better frame time, but not the amount of 16 milliseconds we see in Dark Souls 3. And it consistently holds around the mid to high 30s rather than holding the mid to high 40s. And that is why it doesn't work. It is better than the frame pacing issues that still present themselves in the high mode on the PS4 and the PS4 Pro than the inconsistent pacing issue we had before, but that really doesn't say a lot as this doesn't fix it, whereas in Dark Souls 3 we do see that. Other titles have a similar situation. The Witcher 3, remember, on the Xbox One also came out with an unlocked frame rate, just like Batman Arkham City did on both the PS4 and the Xbox One. But as you can see from the test when the game launched and I covered, it only really hits around the mid-30s on the Xbox One and possibly into the low 40s on the PS4. But again, the issue is the consistency isn't there. It jumps between 50 milliseconds and maybe even higher at points, and that is what the issue is. Not the frame rate, but the frame time. The Pro mode also had an option with boost mode, pushing it into the near 60s at certain points, but these were in indoor quieter areas. It can still dip down into the 30 and below, so even now it's better to cap it at 30, which the team later did on the Pro version when they capped all versions to 30 FPS, as should have been done at release, but I covered all that in my original analysis. So the consistency here is the issue. It's not always about the frame rate, but the frame time. If you hit an average of around 45 to 50, then an uncapped frame rate is always a better option than an inconsistent 30 option. But it doesn't always have to come down to a binary choice. Neo was a perfect example on the PS4 and the Pro that actually offered up the best example here, aside of the titles like Rise of the Tomb Raider, to give you the choice between visuals and frame rate. Now this isn't always an option. Many games can be GPU bound and CPU bound at the same time. So if the CPU doesn't allow you to get to 60 FPS, then it doesn't really matter what you do with the resolution, you're never going to increase beyond what your CPU caps you at. So Neo was able to hit 60 if it lowered the visual quality. So on the Pro and the PS4, you can choose between action mode and movie mode. Now the movie mode favours resolution, i.e. it's a higher resolution overall. It still dynamically scales, but you get a unlocked frame rate which averages around the 45-50, very similar to what we're seeing in the Dark Souls 3 now on the Pro. But if you choose action mode, then you get a near locked 60 on the Pro and a little bit worse on the PS4. But the benefit here is the choice, which is missing from Final Fantasy 15 and Dark Souls 3. And some titles will have both dipping and tearing, like Lords of the Fallen on the PS4. The boost mode does help this out, but it still struggles to hold a consistent frame rate and a non-tearing screen. And it's in very much the same mould as Dark Souls, Blood-Borne and Nioh here, even if it's a little bit slower paced. But it isn't alone in its leap from 30 to 60. A couple of Blood-Borne earlier in the year, which also saw a similar boost on Pro and PS4 and Xbox One. And as you can see with the statistics on screen, you can read more on the website in the full article. This title gains the most of its input latency, boosting from 30 to 60, seeing a mean graph of 133 milliseconds of input latency, right down to 80 milliseconds, around 42% improvement at 60 Hz. Dark Souls 3 sees a far more frugal improvement of around 18% or 19% overall, moving from 158 milliseconds down to 137. So you can see that even though the frame rate has dramatically improved in Dark Souls 3, the input latency is only improved to the tune of 20%, which is still welcome, and you can certainly feel this as you play the title. Now, I hope this video was helpful and beneficial and educational in the difference between frame times, frame rates, and input latency, and hopefully it explained all of these things to you quite clearly, so you now understand it much better. And it also demonstrated that frame rates do not always equal low frame input latency. As an example I used before, Ratchet and Clank, the Order 1886, Second Son also use very low input latency on their titles compared to titles that hit 60 frames per second. These all hit around 70 milliseconds input latency, and as you can see, Blood-Borne at 60 Hz is the only one that gets close to that level. So 30 Hz doesn't mean that you can't have really low input latency. Racing games are very commonly using high input poles, and this is the most important thing, even if the visual presentation always benefits from running at the same refresh rate as the screen you play the game on. Anyway, as always, I hope you guys and girls enjoyed this. If you did, then you know what to do. Leave the like and subscribe below. Give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, or a thumbs down if you didn't. And either way, tell me what you did or didn't like. Please share where appropriate, and I'll catch you on the next one.